The river did not roar. It simply waited. It was as if the waters themselves sensed a shift no mortal eye could see. Egypt, proud and orderly, stood on the edge of an unseen fracture. Its massive monuments cast long shadows across the banks, and in those shadows, a quiet dread began to breathe. This is where the conflict begins. Pharaoh, the living embodiment of divine power, believed the world bowed to his decree. His courts echoed with certainty, his temples thick with incense, praising his lineage. To him, the Hebrews were little more than a labor force, hands without faces, lives without value. Generations of toil had made them invisible, woven into Egypt's prosperity like the mud bricks they shaped under the sun. But one man refused invisibility. Moses returned not with weapons, but with a burden. It was a message from a God Egypt did not fear, and a demand no king expected to hear. He walked into the palace not as a petitioner, but as a witness to oppression and a challenger to authority itself. His very presence unsettled the perfect order Pharaoh had crafted with such precision. Pharaoh dismissed him. Of course, a monarch raised to believe in absolute authority could not imagine a deity outside Aegis's pantheon. To yield would be to fracture his own identity, and power fears cracks more than enemies. Yet Moses' words lingered in the air long after he left the hall, a quiet sentence wrapped in inevitability. This is where the duel truly forms, a man representing a forgotten people, and a king representing a civilization built on their backs, a god demanding release, and an empire demanding obedience. The first tremor in this conflict came not through armies or rebellion, but through nature, the very foundation of Egypt's existence. The Nile, the heart of the kingdom, began to flow with an unnatural heaviness. Fishermen tasted metal in the water. Scribes noted a strange shift in the river's scent, though none dared speak it aloud. Then, at sunrise, the transformation unfolded. The river darkened, not slowly, but all at once, as if pierced by an unseen wound. Its waters thickened, turning the color of fresh blood. Fish surfaced lifelessly. Nets dragged up nothing but decay. The lifeline of Egypt, its symbol of rebirth and divine favor, had become a moving grave. Panic did not come immediately. Egypt was trained to maintain composure, even under threat. Priests examined the phenomenon, offering explanations crafted to protect the illusion of control. Some whispered of red silt, others of seasonal anomalies. But the truth pressed heavily into every corner of the kingdom. Nature itself had turned hostile. Pharaoh refused to bend. He called upon his magicians, demanding reassurance that what Moses predicted was nothing more than manipulation. They mimicked the plague in smaller vessels, offering a hollow comfort that did nothing to restore the river. Their imitation only underscored their own impotence. The Hebrews watched from the edges of the Nile, witnessing a power that mirrored their own rising hope. After years of silence, their cries had reached something beyond the reach of whips and decrees. Yet hope frightened them as much as suffering. Liberation was a word they had not held for generations, and now it hovered before them like a promise too heavy to grasp. Days passed, and the smell grew unbearable. Egyptians covered their faces with linen, but the stench pushed through every barrier. Wells turned crimson. Basins in wealthy homes filled with the same dark fluid that swirled through the poorest corners of the land. No class was spared, no household untouched. What made this moment so unsettling was not only the catastrophe, but its precision. The plague struck with intention, as though guided by an unseen intelligence. It stripped Egypt of its confidence, exposing the fragile structures beneath its grandeur. In the palace, Pharaoh wrestled with the implications. His authority was absolute, yet his river, the symbol of his divine right, had betrayed him. He would not admit fear, not even to himself. Fear was for lesser men, but doubt crept into the edges of his pride, whispering truths he refused to acknowledge. Moses, meanwhile, remained steady. He did not celebrate the river's ruin. He did not glow with triumph. He felt the weight of what was unfolding. He understood that liberation often begins with suffering, and that suffering rarely comes clean. In his silence, there was both resolve and sorrow. By the seventh day, the Nile was no longer a river, but a reminder warning carved in water and death. Egypt had been struck at its core, and yet the confrontation remained unresolved. Pharaoh hardened. His refusal set the stage for further judgment. Moses stood firm. His mission could not end with a plague. It began with one. The central conflict now crystallized. A king unwilling to yield, even as his world trembled, and a prophet unwilling to retreat even as the path ahead darkened. And beneath them both, an entire nation enslaved, exhausted, waiting felt history tilting on its axis. When the river finally released its dead and the waters cleared, the kingdom exhaled with weary relief. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was tension, gathering, strength, preparing to move again. For Egypt believed it had endured the worst, but the plagues had only begun to speak. The duel between mortal pride and divine will was far from over, and the second blow was already forming in the shadows of the land. The waters of the Nile had finally cleared, but the land of Egypt was far from healed. A kingdom that prided itself on order and control now moved with a new, hesitant rhythm. People walked with measured steps, deliberately avoiding the riverbanks, as if the water itself still held a memory, a pulse of the malice that had turned it to blood. In the grand halls of power, officials scribbled optimistic proclamations, trying to convince the public and perhaps themselves that stability had returned. But even their papyrus scrolls seemed to tremble at the corners, betraying the fear that lingered in the air. Pharaoh, a man whose posture never broke, even as his certainty fractured, threw himself back into his daily rituals. He performed them with a frantic urgency, a desperate attempt to hide his own deep-seated lunacy. He ordered incense to be burned in every single corridor of the palace, filling the air with thick, fragrant smoke, as if it alone could push away the haunting memory of crimson water. His priests, ever loyal, offered reassuring explanations. They crafted stories that fed his immense pride, but starved the truth. Yet, in the quiet chambers of his own mind, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to gnaw at him like a silent, relentless parasite. And then Moses returned. He walked into the court with the same calm, unshakable resolve as before. There were no theatrics, no booming voice, just a quiet conviction that Pharaoh, in his arrogance, consistently mistook for simple defiance. Aaron stood by his side, a stabilizing presence, the interpreter whose steady gaze made even the seasoned palace guards shift uncomfortably on their feet. Together, they were a living, breathing embodiment of a truth that Egypt had spent centuries trying to ignore. Pharaoh, true to form, dismissed them again. He was confident that the first plague had been a fluke, a bizarre anomaly, just a momentary tear in the fabric of the natural order. But he failed to understand that moral fractures, when fed by pride, grow deeper and spread faster than anyone can imagine. His refusal to listen, to yield even an inch, only deepened the conflict, pushing both his nation and the Hebrews toward a new, terrifying reckoning. This time, the warning didn't come through the water. It came through its absence. Normally, the Egyptian morning air was alive with sound, the gentle hum of insects, the rustle of reeds along the Nile, all the small, familiar noises that punctuated the start of a new day. But on this day, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, unnatural quiet that pressed down upon the land, like the breath held just before a storm breaks. Farmers paused in their fields, sensing something was wrong. The very texture of the air felt different, thicker, heavier, charged with a strange, expectant energy. Then, the crawling began. At first, it was just a few frogs, emerging from the river's edge. Their movements were sluggish, and their skins were slicked with an unnatural, almost oily sheen. Children pointed, laughing at the strange sight, amused by this unusual gathering. But that amusement quickly curdled into dread. The numbers exploded. What started as a few turned into tens, 10 hundreds, then thousands, spilling from the Nile as if the river itself was vomiting its conscience onto the dry land. Frogs covered everything. They swarmed the roads, making travel impossible. They climbed the hallowed steps of the temples, defiling sacred ground. They slid under doorways and into people's homes. The constant, wet slap of their bodies against stone floors became a sickening rhythm. Their croaking, amplified by the thousands, echoed through grand palaces and humble hovels alike, turning the entire kingdom into a grotesque, discordant chorus. Egypt, The land that worshipped order and Mohat was now held captive by chaos, wearing the slimy green shape of a creature it once revered. Pharaoh tried to maintain his composure, to project an image of unwavering strength. He declared it a mere nuisance, not a legitimate threat. But a nuisance became a full-blown catastrophe within hours. Kitchens overflowed with frogs, hopping into cooking pots and storage jars. Granaries, meant to store the nation's wealth, filled with their writhing, croaking bodies. Even the most sacred chambers of the temple's places where no impurity was ever allowed to enter trembled with the presence of the invading amphibians. In a desperate show of power, Pharaoh summoned his magicians. They attempted to replicate the plague, and to their credit, they succeeded. But in doing so, they only deepened Egypt's humiliation. Their imitation did nothing to restore order. It only amplified the absurdity of the situation. They could summon more frogs, adding to the chaos, but they couldn't make a single one disappear. What did that say about their supposed power? It was a hollow, useless magic in the face of true divine judgment. Throughout it all, Moses watched Egypt's descent with a gaze that held both sorrow and a sense of inevitability. He knew that liberation wouldn't be achieved through comfort or gentle persuasion. Each plague was a mirror, designed to force Egypt, and its king, to confront the brutal consequences of their own hardened hearts. At last, Pharaoh's legendary composure began to falter. His dignity, once an impenetrable fortress, cracked just enough to let a wave of desperation seep through. He summoned Moses and Aaron. This time, his voice held none of its usual authority. It was laced with urgency, with the raw plea of a man who was finally beginning to sense the terrifying scale of what he was up against. He begged them to make the plague end. Moses agreed. He didn't do it out of a sense of triumph, but out of a sense of duty. Understood with a heavy heart that any relief Pharaoh offered would be temporary. It was a hollow promise, carved from fear, not from genuine repentance. Still, he prayed, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of hope stirred in the stagnant, frog-filled air of Egypt. Then, the frogs died. They didn't disappear. They died. Right where they were, millions upon millions of small bodies lay strewn across the land, their forms stiffening under the relentless Egyptian sun. What had been a plague of movement and noise became a plague of stillness and silence. The chaos of croaking was replaced by a new, suffocating horror. Workers were ordered to pile them into massive heaps, but the heaps grew faster than they could ever be removed. And then came the smell, a thick, revolting stench of decay that clung to skin, lodged in throats, and seeped into every courtyard and every home. It was a powerful, unforgettable reminder. Egypt could unescape the consequences of its pride simply by asking for the plague to stop. The price had to be paid. Yet, when the air finally cleared, when the last decaying frog was removed and burned, Pharaoh's resolve hardened once more. The moment the immediate fear receded, his arrogance reclaimed its throne. He retracted his plea. He refused to grant freedom to the Hebrews. He convinced himself that the suffering had been exaggerated, that his kingdom remained unshaken, that it was all just a bad dream. But Egypt had changed. Its people walked differently now, their eyes constantly scanning the ground before each step. Its priests muttered their prayers with a little less confidence. Its nobles whispered their doubts behind embroidered curtains, wondering what would come next. The central conflict had sharpened, a prophet delivering warnings wrapped in mercy, and a king determined to reinterpret every disaster as a mere coincidence. As the last mound of decaying frogs was carried away, the land itself felt fragile, as though some unseen barrier protecting it had thinned. Egypt had survived 2 plagues, but it had learned nothing. Pride still sat on the throne, blind and deaf to the storm that was gathering on the horizon. And somewhere in the dust, where the silence lingered like a held breath, the next judgment was already beginning to rise. The night settled over Riverside with a heavy stillness, the kind that pressed against the windows and magnified every quiet sound. I sat alone at my kitchen table, a single lantern casting a soft glow over the worn wood. The day's conversations replayed in my mind, over and over, in fragments. I could still hear Elon's trembling voice, The nurse's strange hesitation, the sheriff's weak excuses. Every little detail tugged at my instincts, knitting together a picture I couldn't fully see yet, but one I definitely couldn't ignore either. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, trying to sift through all the noise and figure out what really mattered. Ellen had remembered the scent first. It was something chemical, sharp, totally out of place in a hospital room. Then she mentioned a blurry face, a man who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who avoided her gaze and rushed out before she could even say a word. It all lined up with what the nurse told me. Unfamiliar staff, names that weren't in the registry. Someone was slipping in and out of Riverside Clinic with an unnerving confidence, and it seemed like the administration was helping to hide it. My gut tightened. Secrets that required that level of cooperation are rarely harmless. A faint whistle of wind crept through the cracks of the old house. I stood up, paced to the window, and stared out at the dark line of trees bordering the property. Across the dirt road, the clinic's white structure glowed under the moonlight. It looked so peaceful, so ordinary, exactly how someone hiding something would want it to appear. Just as I was about to turn away, a movement caught my eye. A figure emerged from the clinic's side entrance, carrying what looked like a metal case. The person paused, scanned the empty road, then hurried toward an unmarked van parked deep in the shadow of a crooked pine tree. Even from this distance, I recognized the familiar gait was the same man Ellen had described, the one with the quick, uneasy steps. My pulse kicked up a notch. I grabbed my coat, snuffed out the lantern, and slipped out into the cool night air. My boots crunched softly on the gravel as I crossed the road, keeping low behind the tall weeds that grew along the shoulder. The van's back door swung open, revealing shelves stacked with containers, coolers, and sealed bags. The man shoved the metal case inside, wiped his hands on his coat, and pulled out a clipboard. He checked something off, closed the doors with a quiet click, and walked back toward the clinic. I waited, my heart pounding, until he disappeared inside before I circled the van. No plates. No company markings. Nothing at all that identified it as belonging to any legitimate medical service. But a faint hum was coming from inside, telling me there was some kind of refrigeration running. Medical transport. Or maybe something just designed to look like it. I reached for the handle, and then stopped myself. If someone was watching in, I had no doubt someone was one wrong move could give me away. I had to keep my advantage. They didn't know I was suspicious. Not yet. Anyway, I crouched low and scanned the ground. The dirt was still soft from yesterday's rain, soft enough to hold impressions. And when I found the tracks, they weren't just from a van. They were from multiple vehicles' trucks, heavy ones passing through at odd hours. Some of the tracks led toward the clinic's rear building, a place I'd never seen anyone use, its windows always dark and lifeless. As I traced the freshest set of prints, I heard the distant click of a door opening. I straightened up fast and slipped behind a large tree as the back entrance opened again. This time, it wasn't the man with the case. It was Kiran, the new hospital administrator. His polished shoes sank slightly into the mud, his expression tight with stress. He walked directly toward the van, pulled out his phone, and began speaking in a low, clipped voice. I couldn't make out every word, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, frustrated, and defensive. I caught phrases like, "Told you he was asking questions, and can't keep this quiet much longer." And then something about, "If the shipment is late again." Kieran's voice faded as he paced around the van, but the message was crystal clear. They were expecting more shipments, and whatever they were transporting wasn't meant for public eyes. When the administrator finally went back inside, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they were forming was much darker than I'd ever expected. Something harmful, maybe even illegal, was passing through Riverside Clinic, and someone was absolutely desperate to keep it buried. I stepped away from the tree, my mind racing. If I confronted Kiran now, he'd just slam the door in my face with a wall of lies. If I went back to the sheriff, I'd probably hit the same dead end. I needed evidence. Real, hard evidence. Something they couldn't manipulate or sweep away. As I crossed back to my house, the moon dipped behind a cloud, leaving the road shrouded in shadow. The quiet of the night felt heavier now, as though the whole town itself was holding its breath. Ellen's voice, echoed in my thoughts her fear, her confusion, her plea for someone to just believe her. I paused at my doorstep and looked one last time at the clinic, his dark silhouette across the road. I wasn't just dealing with mismanagement or some unethical practices. This was bigger. I was dealing with a system, one built to silence the vulnerable. A system that was willing to manipulate records, smuggle unknown materials, and intimidate anyone who dared to ask the wrong questions. And now, they had just noticed that I was asking them. I opened the door, stepped inside, and locked it securely behind me. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I would go deeper. I would find the source of those shipments, the purpose of those containers, and the truth behind whatever the clinic was hiding in the dark. But tonight, I would rest not because I felt safe, but because I knew I would need every single ounce of strength for what was about to come next. The storm was coming. I could feel it, gathering all around me. Morning crept into Riverside slowly, with a pale gold light that softened nothing of what Tom had learned the night before. He stood on his porch, watching the clinic across the road as if it might reveal its secrets, just by being stared at long enough. But nothing moved. No vans, no strange figures slipping out with metal cases, only a stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. Tom buttoned his coat and started toward town, each step calculated. He knew he couldn't just break into the clinic without a solid plan, and he certainly couldn't expose anything without undeniable proof. But there was another path, one that didn't require sneaking through shadows. Someone in this town had to know what was happening behind the clinic's closed doors. Secrets of this scale never stay perfectly sealed. They leak through whispers, through regrets, through guilt. He headed straight for the Riverbend Diner, the place where gossip collected like dust on the window panes. Inside, warm air wrapped around him, carrying the scent of brewed coffee and fried bread. A few locals were hunched over their morning meals, their conversations low and cautious. Whoever was running these secret operations had the whole town walking on eggshells. Fear could do that to people, make them quiet, make them turn a blind eye. Tom slid into a booth near the back, where he had a clear view of everyone entering and leaving. The waitress, Nora, sharp-eyed and habitually observant, approached with a raised brow. "You look like a man carrying too many thoughts," she said as she poured his coffee. He offered a tired smile. "It was a long night. Long nights usually come from trouble." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And Riverside has plenty of that lately." Her tone was careful, but her eyes held something else, a hint of knowledge she wasn't quite ready to share. Tom took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the warmth steady him. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Nora hesitated, her gaze shifting toward the door before returning to him. "People going missing. Sick folks being moved without any explanation. Deliveries at odd hours, and the clinic hiring staff that no one recognizes." She glanced around again, making sure no one was listening. "You didn't hear that from me." Tom's pulse steadied into focus. This was it. The first crack in the wall of silence. "You ever see the administrator, Kieran? Meeting with anyone unusual?" A shadow passed across her expression. "He meets with plenty of people, but only at night, and never inside the diner. Because he's trying to avoid being seen. Because he knows he's being watched," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Tom could respond, the door chimed. Two men stepped inside, broad-shouldered, stiff-backed, and trying way too hard to blend in. Their eyes swept the room, pausing just for a moment on Tom. Nora immediately straightened, her friendly expression snapping back into place like a mask. "You should finish your coffee and leave from the back," she murmured, keeping her smile fixed. "Some folks here don't like questions." Tom didn't need to look twice to know who she meant. The men took a booth near the entrance, their gaze never leaving him. Their intent was obvious, not to act, but to warn. He finished his cup in 2 quick swallows, slid out of the booth, and gave a subtle nod to Nora. Then he slipped into the kitchen, pushed through the back door, and stepped out into the alley. The cold air hit him like a slap. He walked quickly, but calmly, turning corners with purpose, making sure the men weren't trailing him. When he finally reached the quiet stretch behind the abandoned freight building, he paused to catch his breath. Someone was watching Riverside more closely than he'd realized, and now they were watching him. He ran a hand over his jaw, thinking, Every attempt to investigate directly was closing off. They were tightening their circle, pushing him out, warning him without ever speaking a word. But if they thought intimidation would slow him down, they'd forgotten who he was. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. This was about a town held hostage by fear. He headed toward the river next, where old Mr. Barlow sat every morning, repairing nets he hadn't used in years. The old fisherman didn't talk much, but he noticed everything. Most people treated him like a relic, a piece of the town's past. But Tom knew better. Barlow was a keeper of secrets. The old man squinted at him as he approached. "You're out early." "So are you," Tom replied. "I'm always out." He handed Tom a frayed section of rope. "Sit. Pretend you're helping me." Tom sat beside him on the weathered wooden crate. "I need to ask you something." Barlow snorted, not looking up from his work. "Everyone needs to ask something, but no one ever likes the answers." Tom lowered his voice, getting straight to the point. "What's happening at the clinic?" For a long moment, the only sound was the river's slow current and the rustle of the old net. Then Barlow finally muttered, "They're moving people, not patients, not staff. People who don't look sick, but they don't look free either." Tom's chest tightened. The word hung in the air between them. "Free? You ever see someone walk like they don't know what fresh air feels like?" Barlow's voice trembled slightly. "Like they're waiting for permission just to breathe. That's how they move. And every time one of them leaves that clinic, a new one shows up within a day or two." Tom felt the weight of those words settle deep inside him. This wasn't about illegal medicine or secret shipments anymore. This was about human lives controlled, transported, hidden in plain sight. "Why hasn't anyone said anything?" Tom asked quietly, his voice filled with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Because whoever speaks up disappears," Barlow replied, his voice grim. "Or someone they love." Tom looked at the old man, at the tremor in his weathered hands, at the fear etched so deeply into his face that it had become part of his posture. How long had this been happening? How many people had vanished while the rest of the town pretended not to see? "So why tell me?" Tom whispered. Barlow's eyes finally met his, and they were clear, steady, and unwavering. "Because you're the only fool in this town who might actually do something about it." Tom stood up slowly, a decision forming inside him like a spark ready to ignite a fire. He needed evidence, yes, but he also needed allies, people who were willing to speak, to resist, to fight back. The clinic's entire operation thrived on silence, and breaking that silence would be the first blow. As he walked away from the river, the wind shifted, carrying the faint, metallic scent that Ellen had described. It drifted from the direction of the clinic, subtle yet unmistakable. Tom's jaw set. Tonight, he would return, not to watch from a distance, not to guess from the shadows. Tonight, he would step into the darkness they thought he feared, and he would drag the truth out into the light. The time for observation was over. The time for action had begun. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next video.